All right, let's just jump right in with a big question. One that gets to the heart of, well, everything we're about to talk about. What is your functional authority in your life? I mean, not what you say it is, but what actually, day to day, guides your choices. What's the real final say for you? Just kind of keep that question in the back of your mind.
Because you see, that very same question of authority, it's right at the center of one of the biggest, most intense conflicts in the Gospels, that clash between Jesus and the Pharisees. So that's what we're going to do today. We're going to break down this major showdown between God's law and, well, human tradition.
Okay, so here's the game plan for this explainer. We're going to start with what seems like a small thing, a fight over washing hands. Then we'll dig into this thing called the tradition of the elders. From there, we'll see what happens when rules start to eclipse God, look at Jesus' takedown of hypocrisy, and wrap up with what he said really matters.
So it all kicks off around a simple meal. But believe me, this was no ordinary argument over who gets the last piece of bread. Nope, this was a moment that blew the lid off a huge spiritual conflict. Let's see how it went down.
So right here in the book of Mark, we see the accusation. You've got the Pharisees and the scribes, basically the religious experts of the day, and they see Jesus' disciples eating with what they call defiled hands. And they're not just asking a question, this is a challenge. They're basically saying, you guys are breaking the rules.
Okay, and this is super important. This had absolutely nothing to do with germs or being clean in the way we think of it. The issue was something called ritual purity. Being unclean was a symbolic thing. It meant you touched something that, in their system, made you unfit to go to the temple and worship. So for them, this wasn't a small deal, it was a huge spiritual foul.
So to really get why they were so worked up, we have to ask, where did this rule even come from? Because here's the twist. It wasn't actually in the written law of Moses. Nope. It came from something else entirely, what was known as the tradition of the elders.
And what was that? Well, the tradition of the elders was this massive body of oral teachings and interpretations. Think of it like this. You have the original law from God, and then generations of scholars and scribes added layers and layers of commentary, rules, and applications on top of it. The key thing to remember is that these were human traditions, not God's original commands.
You can kind of see how the authorities shifted over time. First, you have Moses, who gets the law straight from God. Then, for hundreds of years, you have scribes who interpret it and expand on it. And then, not too long before Jesus shows up, a group called the Pharisees comes on the scene. And their whole thing was being absolutely meticulously devoted to following all of these extra traditions.
Now, it's really easy to just paint the Pharisees as the bad guys, right? The villains of the story. But that's a little too simple. These guys were incredibly serious about their faith. I mean, their people's history was full of stories of disobedience to God, and they saw their job as making sure that never happened again. They wanted to build offensive rules around God's law so that nobody could even accidentally break it. So their intentions, they came from a place of zeal, even if it ended up being seriously misguided.
And this is where we get to the absolute heart of the problem that Jesus points out. The real danger isn't the traditions themselves. The danger happens when those human traditions get treated like they're on the same level as God's commands, or, even worse, when they start to become more important.
And Jesus' response, man, it is just devastating. He doesn't just argue with them, he goes straight to their own scriptures and quotes the prophet Isaiah right back in their faces. He calls them hypocrites, saying, "This people honors me with their lips, but their heart is far from me." He's accusing them of just going through the motions, teaching human rules as if they were God's own doctrines.
And he gives this perfect, jaw-dropping example of what he means. It's this thing called the Corban rule. So God's command is crystal clear, right? Honor your father and your mother. Simple. But the Pharisees had this tradition where a person could declare their money or property as Corban, meaning a gift dedicated to God. And once they did that, they could use it as a loophole to get out of financially supporting their elderly parents. Just think about that. They were using a man-made rule to completely nullify one of God's core commandments.
This whole conflict really comes to a head later on in the Gospel of Matthew. Jesus unleashes what are known as the 7 woes. It's the series of absolutely blistering critiques that don't just target their actions, but tear away the mask to reveal what's going on inside.
And the word he keeps using is hypocrite. It helps to know that in the original Greek, a hypocrite was literally a stage actor, someone who wears a mask. So when Jesus calls them hypocrites, he's saying, you're acting. Your public religious life is just a performance, and it's hiding a totally different reality underneath.
And the images he uses to make his point are just unforgettable.
He says they're so careful they'll tie the tiniest spices from their garden, like mint and dill, but they completely ignore the massive things: justice, mercy, and faithfulness. He says they strain a tiny gnat out of their wine but swallow a camel whole. Do you see the insane loss of perspective? They're obsessed with cleaning the outside of the cup, but inside it's filled with greed. They're like whitewashed tombs, beautiful and clean on the outside, but inside, just full of death and decay. Okay, so if that's the problem, what's the answer? Well, Jesus never just tears something down without building something up. He redirects their focus, and ours. He points away from all the external rituals and points toward what's at the very heart of a real relationship with God. Instead of the tiny details, he tells them to focus on what he calls the weightier matters of the law. And what are those? It's not some long, complicated checklist. It's just 3 things: justice, mercy, and fidelity. How we treat people, our compassion for those who are hurting, and our faithfulness to God. That's it. That's the stuff that really matters. So what this whole conflict boils down to are 2 totally different paths to being right with God. There's the path of self-righteousness, that's all about pride, trusting in your own performance, your own rule-keeping, and where does that always lead? To judging other people. But then there's the path of the gospel. That's about humility. It's about trusting in God's mercy for you, not your own record. And that path, that one leads to compassion for others. And what's so incredible, so moving, is that right after this fiery takedown, Jesus' tone shifts completely to heartbreak. His anger wasn't coming from a place of cold judgment. It was the grief of rejected love. He uses this beautiful image of a mother hen trying desperately to gather her little chicks under her wings to protect them, but they wouldn't come. It just reveals this deep, tragic sorrow at the heart of it all. And this is where it all comes back home to us, right? Because this isn't just some ancient history lesson. We all have traditions in our families, in our culture, in our churches, in our own personal lives. And traditions can be great things. They can be beautiful and helpful. But the danger that Jesus pointed out 2,000 years ago, it's just as real for us today. So let's end where we started, with a question for you to think about. When you look at your life, your rules, your routines, your traditions, which ones are actually helping you grow in justice, mercy, and faithfulness? And which ones, maybe even really good ones, have accidentally become the point of it all? Which ones have started to hide the very thing they were supposed to be protecting? In your life, what's the fence and what's the treasure?